Hello, and we are live with another episode of Absolute AppSec. This is episode 19. I'm Ken Johnson, one of the hosts, joined by Seth Law, my
Hey,
co-host.
everybody. Welcome once again.
Last week, if you missed it, we had on Chris Gates, a good friend of Seth and I, and you should go check that out if you haven't watched it yet. Pretty good overview of purple teaming, upcoming preview of one of his talks, his keynote, just a lot of good things. His origin story, like a lot of little interesting tidbits there. So that was last episode. How are you, Seth? How are you doing this week?
Hey, I'm hanging in there. It was a good one. We did actually open up Slack too, right? For anybody that wants to join the conversation or get a hold of us or send in topics or even just throw stuff at us virtually. If you go to the website absoluteappsec.com, there's a link there to actually sign up for Slack. You can go ahead and jump on into the general channel and give us a shout out.
Nice.
Yeah. Other than that, there's still to do stuff on my list as far as the show goes, including getting us listed on both Apple's podcasts and Stitcher and some of the other audio formats for pushing out the different episodes. That'll be happening soon enough. It's more of the fact that we hit summer and now the kids are out of school and we're both lazy, right? Right, Ken? That's what it is.
Yeah, super lazy.
Yeah. Yeah. But the other thing is, right, Ken's been dealing with the fact that he has to become a Microsoft employee, within a specific period of time, right?
Yeah, that's been actually before we talk about that,
Okay.
on to-dos, I owe people. So I was supposed to have mailed some stuff to people. So I will do that likely this week. But I've been traveling and excuses. I'll get that stuff out soon, but I owe some folks some stuff. So, but yeah, so GitHub. I think most people that watch probably know I work for GitHub, and so that news came out. The interesting thing, Seth, was that when everybody was talking about this. When I say everybody in our little social network was talking about this. And what's funny is I didn't know anything about it, literally like not a clue until other people were talking about it and pasting it on, Slack and Twitter and all that. So that was how I found out, was through and Sunday night, it's like, there was obviously a lot of speculation about it because that's when I think it was Bloomberg or someone came out and said it was going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I saw that and I'm like, whoa, like I knew at that point that it wouldn't come out like that unless it was very likely true. So, not the media doesn't say stuff that isn't true, but I had a pretty good feeling on that one. So
what you're saying is that GitHub did not consult you as an application security professional on whether or not becoming Microsoft or becoming a portion of Microsoft was a good idea.
I know it's hard to believe, but
there seems like some missed due diligence there. Well, maybe the application security guys from Microsoft check that out because they're the ones that are acquiring you, right? Not the other way around, but still.
Actually, I'm interested to meet those folks, as a matter of fact. Hopefully we get that opportunity, but yeah,
actually, it's interesting that you say that. At Hack West this year, one of our speakers was from Microsoft, and she was talking about. Let me pull up her name really quick. She was talking about Tanya Janka. She She Hacks Purple, right? I know she's like a Microsoft advocate, but she's going around talking about OWASP Top 10 and how they implement, a secure SDLC at Microsoft. It was pretty interesting, but she's kind of an outreach person rather than somebody that I mean, she's on the like engineering teams, but it's a lot more about coordination and things like that. But all very OWASP related. I'll pull it up here. So apparently, I know more people at Microsoft than you do. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, for one. Although I did get to see the CEO this week at the all hands on it's Tuesday. Gosh, Monday. It's yesterday. So I did get to the CEO spoke to all of us. Probably won't go into too much about what was said just because of confidentiality. I will point out David Corsi is cracking me up with this little he's got a clippy image. It says it looks like you're trying to host a podcast. Would you like some help with that? Super funny. I mean, the jokes have been, that's probably been one of the more enjoyable aspects from Twitter is just watching the awesome jokes that have come out about all this. I know there's mixed reactions and like, honestly, I don't, there's mixed reactions on it. In terms of outside the company, I can tell you internally, it's been overwhelmingly positive from everybody I've seen. It's been very positive. So, and also like the one thing I don't know if a lot of people think about this, but like, so if your company gets acquired, right, as a private company, if you're going to like, let's say you're an employee, or you're just a part of the company and your goal is to make any sort of money off, stock options or anything like that. Usually the goal of a private company in especially in Silicon Valley, the goal is right, like IPO or get acquired or something like that, right? So now the difficulty in like an IPO though is that now you've got pressures from shareholders, from board members that are in the general public, and that becomes more stressful than this type of situation where you've got a company like ours operating independently, but with the backing of a global corporation. And when you look at it from that standpoint, the yes, there's still pressure. Sure, of course, you have to perform. That's what a business is about. But it's very different from like having IPO'd. And at the same time, everybody, ideally in this situation, and I can't speak to it because I actually don't have any hard numbers and I don't know anything yet. But typically, when something like this happens, it's good for all the employees, at least fiscally. And so you've got that going for you. And then in terms of the culture and the company, I think everybody I know or I'm close to has at least pointed out the fact that, in recent times, 4 to 5 years, Microsoft has been doing a lot to try and basically expand into the open source realm and support open source and just becoming sort of a different company under the current CEO's leadership. So.
Yeah, I don't necessarily see it as a completely bad thing, right? I mean, obviously, if you're a Microsoft competitor in any of those spaces, you're probably moving your code off of GitHub, because but realistically, as long as there is somewhat of a firewall, somewhat of a separation between the two, I don't see it as a huge issue, right? I mean, you're still trusting that Microsoft's going to keep your data safe, whether it's, you're using the Xbox Live, you're using some of their other services. I don't necessarily see GitHub as going away or changing that much. And from what you've said as well, and what I'm kind of seeing, I feel like it will be pretty hands off, at least from like somebody from the outside looking in. Realistically, I'll still use GitHub, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, I had seen a few security people mention like, well, and honestly, we're going to have one of them on, Robert Fuller. I gave him through some dates. So Mubix on Twitter, Rob Fuller, again, a friend of Seth and I, he's going to come on, and he had an opinion, and I'm not singling him out. There were lots of folks that were like, well, like you said, like, oh, well, I don't want Microsoft looking at my code. But what I would say to that is that, and again, I'm not a public spokesperson. right, for GitHub. I just happen to work there. But if you were to ask me, I would tell you that this is one of those places where people care very dearly about your privacy, more so than any. I mean, like, I just don't think I can overstate that as enough, really, honestly. Like, I can't basically, you know what I'm trying to say? Like, I can't say it enough. Like, people really care about your privacy, about protecting users' code, about protecting their anonymity, just things in general that like the public doesn't know, or maybe some people know because they know people at GitHub. But that's something that's cared about deeply and is ingrained in the culture. So I think you'd have to. It would be. It's unlikely that it's very. I would say, in my opinion, it's not going to happen. Like, that's not a concern you need to worry about. But again, I'm not a spokesperson for the company. I just happen to work there.
So can you tell me what tools you use internally to look at everyone's code? Is that oh, wait, sorry, that's the wrong direction.
Yeah, no, yeah, jerk.
Yeah.
No, but I saw it, and it's just like, I'm being very politically correct, I think, right now. But like, the basic gist is that's not a real fear. It isn't. Like, I can tell you from having worked there, like, that's not a real thing. But people have, I mean, people have all kinds of fears. So, rational or otherwise, whatever.
I mean, if you were worried about the protecting your code, right, and it was that sensitive, most likely you wouldn't be using GitHub in the first place, right? I mean, or you'd be using a private instance. But that being said, right? Okay, it's Microsoft. What are your developers using to actually access and write that code? Okay, are they using, Windows 10 and it's phoning home, right? Like, how much control do you have there as well? I mean, there's just a lot of like other variables that probably go into that realistic threat assessment. Everybody's knee-jerk reaction during an acquisition is typically, oh no, what's going to change? Why are they doing it? And obviously, you'll have more insight into that as far as what the leadership there at GitHub and at Microsoft is saying about their interest in GitHub. So,
yeah, I mean, I can't speak to some of the more the things that are certainly confidential, but I can the things that have been shared publicly are, and this was reiterated many times, I should say, which was, we have cultivated a community. We've helped diversity and inclusion with software development, with reaching, basically enabling software developers, and putting that sort of building up a larger base of software development, and doing positive things for that community. And that's something Microsoft wants to sort of learn. At least that's again, publicly, this has been made public. Like, the goal is to sort of allow GitHub to sort of teach Microsoft how to get there, I guess, if that makes any sense. But yeah, I mean, I understand it. I totally get it. And Microsoft's a big business, and I totally get and understand. I'm sensitive to those that are concerned, or were concerned, or whatever. I will say, on the other hand, and I'm not going to state the company name, but Chris Gates, who was on last week, had a funny tweet, and it's actually super, super true too. If you look at this company's like vulnerability releases, he's like, sure, move all your code to this other company until it gets pwned, or like until there's a remote code execution vulnerability on there. And that made me at least chuckle, because he's not wrong. Like, but yeah, I'm not putting down any specific company. I just thought it was more of a funny tweet.
yeah, I mean, the risk is always there, and then yeah, I don't know if there's really much more to say to that outside of, I think it'll be interesting to watch how Microsoft goes about that. I mean, it brings up questions to me, having been around for a while, about, okay, they've got their like Team Foundation server or whatever, their like their own code repository tool. So, where did it come into play that, hey, we're going to acquire GitHub as well? Maybe they're moving some of their back end to that. There's other things that are coming into play there that are question marks for me, just watching from the outside. But again, as far as hosting my code and using GitHub services, that's kind of the least of my worries or the least of my like questions when it comes to it. So
yeah, everybody's got their own take on it, and it's been interesting to watch for sure.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I will say, like, at a certain point, I couldn't go on Twitter for like about 12 hours. I was like, all right, I can't do this anymore. I can't watch Twitter. Like, it was
just because it was just too raw, or
it was too, because you're finding out this news, and then you've got all these. Twitter is a place that people go to pretty quickly, voice an opinion, and that's not the best place to go and read material as as something's occurring that you're still figuring out like how you feel about it. You know what I mean? So I think you sort of have to feel like, for me, I had to figure out how I felt about it first before like going and reading through everybody else's sort of take on it. So
knee-jerk reactions. Yeah.
Well,
I mean, like any big company acquisition, it's going to take a long time. So it's just what's coming in the future. Which kind of brings us to a natural topic, right? Is what's in your future, Ken?
So I'm assuming you don't mean I'm
not job changes, right?
Yeah. I was like, no, I'm not going anywhere. Heck yeah, I'm good. No, yeah. So we got a few things going on coming up. I mean, one of the things I'll bring up, like not related to us or myself, but we do have some upcoming speakers coming on the podcast. So on the I think it's the 19th. I don't know. I have to look at the calendar. So today's the 5th. Yeah. So 14 days. So June 19th, Alex Smollen's coming on. I mentioned Rob Fuller, Ken Toller. He is coming on, and Jim Manico. So we've got some pretty good speakers, some interesting perspectives, definitely people that work in different aspects of both application security and security in general. So that's awesome. And you and I have so the one thing we wanted to mention for sure is that you and I have a training course coming up at AppSec USA.
Yeah, we got accepted. So like we submitted, obviously, the CFP process, and we're going to talk about a little bit about CFPs later on the podcast today. But we submitted a training proposal to AppSec USA to teach people about code reviews, right? Most of the current crop of code review courses that we see are very much geared towards specific technologies, right? So you go learn secure coding for Node.js or secure coding for Java. And we can talk to like Manico about this, to Jim Manico, because he's got a training company that he runs, and that's basically what he does, is goes around and trains people on different things. But as Ken and I were talking about it, like a lot of our day-to-day lives is a code review methodology, right? It's not just, hey, we need to know how to like be able to code securely in one specific language. It's more the approach in general on how we go about identifying vulnerabilities in code, whatever language that happens to be. And I think it's something that served, like me personally, well when approaching new languages, right? So if somebody throws an application in some new hipster language, right, like I like to say, there are ways, there's things that you can do and avenues that you can use to actually speed up the process to help you think about a code base and how to identify vulnerabilities, right?
What happened was, what I think is funny is what happened, because it was on this podcast. I don't know. We made a joke about like reading comments, to-dos or something like that in source code, and somebody tweeted that out. And then you and I got to talking, and we're like, we probably should just all these little tips and tricks, like probably should just put something together and
yeah. And I'm hoping that there's going to be appetite for it, right? Because there's a lot of people in our space that are doing some sort of application security or product security that may be coming from a development background or even a pen testing background, but need some pointers on identifying things in code. Anyway, so that's our little spiel on the course that's coming up. Watch for like advertisement and stuff from AppSec USA. We'll obviously tweet out about it when it pops up and registration is open. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, well, I wanted to mention, because I know you've got, one of the things we wanted to talk about tonight, because I know you got Tracker also coming up. So that's another, so this was for AppSec USA, it was a CFT we responded to. This is a CFP, call for papers for Hacker Tracker that you, so you are going to be speaking at DEF CON, but well, first of all, congrats on that.
Thanks.
I should say that. That's all. And that's going to be you and Whitney?
Yeah. Yep. Short Stack on Twitter. She's the one that writes the Android version. And last year when we were talking to Nikita and some of the DEF CON people about Hacker Tracker, they kind of suggested that that they at least wanted a walkthrough of Hacker Tracker for DEF CON 101 stuff, right? Anybody who's new to DEF CON, hey, here's the app, this is how you use it, that kind of thing. But we thought it would be more interesting to actually dive into the history of Hacker Tracker and number one, why we wrote it, because it takes a fair bit of time, right? I think I'm on my fourth year, something like that, of putting hours and hours into something that for DEF CON. And the first few years were not necessarily supported by DEF CON. They'd give us access to the schedule, but that was about it. But so the talk's going to be about Hacker Tracker, building it, our experiences with trying to serve, hackers and the InfoSec industry and get people to actually install something on their phones when everyone is doesn't want to, right? And it should be fun, right? It'll be a short intro into that and why we do it. But it's always one of those things, trying to get something accepted in a large conference like that. I know, Ken, you've spoken at RSA before, with Chris, right?
Yeah, I think that was a one and done thing, man. That was that was an ordeal. That was a whole, because they want to have quality talks, so they put you through the ringer. But this I guess I'm not going to be politically correct on this one. They make you do a bunch of work, and that conference makes a ton of money, and they give you pretty much jack shit for it. They put you through the ringer. They make you do all kinds of stuff, which I totally get. You want to have you want to have your speakers there. You want to have quality talks, and you want people to pay a premium to get in, and you want it to be good and all that stuff. And that's fine. I'm willing to follow some standards, but there was absolutely no recompense, we should say. There was nothing done special for speakers. It was like literally traveling to Switzerland for Insomniac, which is a whole other topic of how international conferences, I feel, are often better accommodating to speakers than domestic. But anyways, Switzerland to a small conference, Insomniac, which I really enjoyed. Man, they took care of us as speakers, really, really well. And the same for the talk we just did in Brazil. And, RSA, again, they've got the budget, and, they put you through all that. And I guess the idea is we're RSA, so if you speak here, it's good for your career or it's good for your company, I guess. But I don't know, man, that's, how did I get off on that tangent?
Well, no, we were talking about CFPs and talking at large conferences. Part of me feels like it has a lot to do with the amount of who's running the conference, right? And basically what the purpose behind it is. mean, there's quite a community behind DEF CON. It is really difficult to get a talk accepted there without some sort of an in, or at least like some new research, something that's fairly hot, right? Black Hat's related to that, but not so much anymore, right? Black Hat is now owned by, what is it, UBM, or whatever big conference company that is. So it's all about cost cutting and making sure that they preserve their margins for conferences. So, however much people are paying, that's what they're looking at as the bottom line, as opposed to, some of the community conferences where it's, all right, we're trying to make this as inexpensive as possible and as good as possible, because we're not trying to take a huge amount out of it, right?
Yeah, and I mean,
but
yeah. Yeah. And I should say, I just want to point out that not every conference, because like you said, there's these different demographics, what they're going for and all that. And I don't want to say like every domestic conference, I mean, like certainly like LastCon's a good example. They treat their speakers really well. So that doesn't apply everywhere. And like you said, it does depend on, the kind of conference that you're going to, for sure. Right. So, but I would say RSA is definitely a money-making event, right? Like that's what it is. It is a business networking, money-making event. So that's I mean, I don't even know if they think that's my opinion. I think it's just the reality.
Yeah, and you see that, right? Like those of us that have been to RSA, it's not the same as going to Black Hat or DEF CON, right? It's very much, business suit, people actually wearing ties, which is not something you're going to find at DEF CON, right? It's just not. Maybe, like, I guess, black and white or black and gold ball or whatever it is, right, that one night. But the rest of it is pretty, yeah. But that being said, I mean, what sort of feedback did you get for speaking at RSA, right? Did you feel like there was any sort of a bump, personally with your brand or anything like that on Twitter or in the industry for having presented there?
No, not really, man. Plus, I mean, like, I am who I am. I'm not, if I wanted to, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, I didn't really do it for my brand. I happened to work for a company that needed it. But besides that, I don't, everybody should care about their brand a little bit. I'm just saying, like, I wasn't trying to get famous off that or security famous or whatever off that. That was just something that made sense at the time, for the company I was working for.
Yeah.
And, I mean, the company we were working for at one point, I should say. And, but no, I didn't feel any huge bump. And then, the one thing I will say though that was pretty cool is that I did get an interview. Chris and I got an interview with Steve Reagan from CSO Online, and that was pretty cool. That was at RSA, and if we hadn't been speaking there, we wouldn't have done that interview. So that in and of itself was kind of cool, just because there was like an interview out there. That felt kind of cool. Again, that having been said, I'm sure all of 10 people watched it, so it's not like it was a huge bump or anything. But yeah, the process was really difficult, which is one of the things we want to talk about was like, CFPs and, like what is it? I'm laughing. I shouldn't watch Slack and Twitter and all this stuff because it makes me laugh when I see stuff and I get distracted. So what's I gonna say? All right. So we want to talk about CFPs and submitting them and what works and what doesn't. I think is like, because you and I were talking about this before we started, like just the rejection of conferences. Yeah. And we've been on, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you've been on, I mean, I would say I only once did I look at speakers and grade them, and it was for AppSec DC, but I've talked to so many people as they're going through the process of grading talks. So I'm at least somewhat familiar with that like process. Have you done a bit of grading of people's talks and all that?
Just local conferences is all I've done, like the B-Sides and the Hack West. I do, like, I am good friends with, we both worked with Nathan Hamill for a while. He's on the Black Hat review board. And I know Grifter, Neil as well. and he does both Black Hat and DEF CON talks. I mean, it's not an easy process by any stretch, especially once the conference gets big. And there are people that are looking to, present original research, which is something you always want as an information security conference, right? You want that hit that, hey, guess what? This is where people come to actually reveal something or drop an O-Day. I mean, as much as we like kind of, from the defensive side, it's like, all right, is that super interesting? Yes, it can be, but it's like, it does bring the conference a lot of exposure, right? But where am I going with this? I mean, just basically from the side of someone that's reviewing talks, it takes a lot of effort, right? And it's not only the effort that the submitter puts into it, but also what the reviewer puts into it, that you've got to take into account. So like when you are submitting a talk, you've got to realize who your audience is and how you need to stand out. The easiest way to get accepted is obviously to know someone that's either on the review board or is organizing the conference, right? Because they're going to look out for your talk, and they probably won't be as critical, or they at least know you as an entity, right? I mean, we know that Ken can go and speak at RSA. So, hey, it probably isn't. It's a safe bet that he could come to, your local B-Sides or your local OWASP event and be engaging for an hour. That's fair. That's a fairly easy decision to make, right?
I don't know how much truth there is to that, but engaging for an hour.
For an hour, okay.
Well, I guess we do this podcast for an hour. We'll see how engaged people are.
Yeah, but, exactly.
No, but yeah, I mean, and it's definitely it definitely comes down to the demographic of the conference, right? Because like we were talking about, sometimes it's the research itself is what's drawing people to the conference, and then sometimes it's just like you'll see talks that you've seen somewhere else presented at a conference, and people are fine with it because it is a really compelling speaker, and that's always a weird thing. Is like you have to figure out if you're grading CFPs, are you going for? Oftentimes it's a mix, but there's certainly talks that can get in there that are just like, this person's a really compelling speaker. They're really good at this. And we've seen them over and over again. And they've got what you call a brand, and it might be interesting to watch. And I've seen, and actually, there's no harm in that. I've definitely seen talks that are like, they're not super elite or anything, but they're engaging, they're interesting. I sit there and I'm like, at least I'm thinking after I watch them. So in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, certainly nice to have both. Having said that, also some of the most boring talks I've seen are the most boring talk I've ever seen from I shouldn't say boring. That's not the right word. Because technically it was very interesting. It was the most technical talk I'd ever seen. It was at ShmooCon. I think the first year I went to ShmooCon, it's like, I went to ShmooCon, and that was that talk and that conference and that year was like when I was like solid on security. I was like, this is amazing. These are my people. This is awesome. But in terms of it being a good talk, it was probably one of the worst talks I've seen in terms of, the things that you talk about with verbal tics and with awkwardness on stage and with delivery and all that stuff. So, but it was back then, this is years. I mean, this is probably 8 years ago. This is on FPGAs, and that was pretty interesting, pretty new. So that was really cool.
Yeah. Brian's bringing that up in the Slack channel, how sometimes a great abstract can be a train wreck presentation, right? It's very hard to gauge, when the presentations come into you for the CFPs, like all those submissions get there, that the person that's submitting it can actually engage people, can actually talk. And he's saying the same thing, right? So he's helping put together B-Sides PGH. And they tried to do blind submissions, and it didn't go as well as they had hoped, right? And
I've seen that happen, and it's just as you said, it doesn't go as well as you plan. You don't. I think the idea is Well, I'm pretty sure the idea is to remove bias, right? To
Yeah.
remove corporate bias, to remove gender bias, to remove some of those things. But again, you have to factor in what level of like it's okay, because I think it's always hard because you want to have a certain percentage of just interesting talks, but again, you also want to have a good percentage of interesting speakers. So being
Yeah.
technical and being a good speaker are not always the same thing, which is, I hate to
Well,
burst anyone's bubble out there.
yeah, it's a different skill set for sure, right? I mean, I remember being terrified to speak, earlier in my career, just purely from the whole, fear of, you know, of not knowing enough, not being able to actually answer questions, um, the imposter syndrome. Uh, and I know we've talked about that before. I know it was even on our first episode, right? That we talked a little bit about feeling that imposter syndrome and trying to overcome it and realizing that everybody else has felt it at some point in their career. But it's really hard to get over that, um, even when you're evaluating talks, right? Because I see talks come into like, Hack West this last year, and as I'm looking through them, and we're trying to do something that's similar to a blind submission process, so the reviewers only have the abstract and certain things, but it's all we try to weight it a little bit with the people that actually know who submitted the talks, because but the level of technicality that comes across in the abstracts at times just blows me away, right? You go look at any information security conference and it's like, wow, I could go to 15 of these talks and probably learn something in each one, just based on the abstract alone. Whether or not the talk actually reflects that is a different story. And I think that's where we run into issues, is that it's even a black hat and a DEF CON, right? Just because someone has started that research doesn't necessarily mean it's going to match the level of expectation that comes out in the abstract. And I know we're kind of running down a rabbit hole here on CFPs. I mean, Jason on Slack is asking about requiring some sort of sample video.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna mention regarding Jason's comment. So whenever I can't say always, but most of the time when I submit, I do try to give prior art, we'll call it, so links to previous talks, and in the hopes that helps. I don't know if you can require it for everyone. There might be somebody who's kind of coming out of their shell. They might have. I mean, one thing, as a speaker, I recommend doing, and I learned this from Chris Gates, was just go to meetups before you do the big presentation, just local meetups. The double-edged sword with that, though, is like why I'm mentioning that is, you could have that recorded, but the problem is now it's recorded, and the talk you're going to give for the first time at this conference and at any conference, now it's out on the web. So the best thing to do is, if it's your first, I think if it's this person's first talk, it's probably just, you can always have a conversation with them, I suppose, about like, hey, do you plan to practice, at meetups or do something along those lines? But for anyone who has spoken before, I do think it makes sense to at least ask for it, for like previous talks that they've done that have been recorded. I think that makes sense. But them doing it at home is not the same. The reason I'm saying this is because the question was, a sample video, but a sample video, if it's done at like home, that is not the same as, doing it live, where you've got people staring at you and you have to make sure you don't get lost in your head, which is a huge problem, was a huge problem for me. And I obviously still is on the podcast, but you can stumble. You've got the pressure of people watching you. And I don't think it's the same thing as showing previous. And then I guess what we should say is, what are people looking for with CFPs? I mean, Seth, you have a better I can tell you like what elsewhere, right? But I don't know what DEF CON and Black Hat's looking for, and I think that might be probably the most interesting, because obviously that's typically where people want to end up speaking, is DEF CON and Black Hat.
Yeah. What I found, and this is, actually the first time that I spoke at both Black Hat and DEF CON, I was lucky enough to speak with Nathan, right, Hamill, and he had it's almost like a puzzle that you've got to crack, right? Like you not only do you have to have something that's kind of innovative and you're willing to put the time in and to do the research and to do the paper and everything that's required, but you've also got to put together you've got to spend almost as much time putting together your CFP and your abstract to actually get it accepted. And even then, there is no guarantee that that's going to happen. The one thing that you've got to realize with both those conferences is the number of talks that they get means that they're rejecting probably at least 95% of the talks that come in.
Wow, that's a huge rejection.
Yeah, I mean, it may be interesting to talk to Nathan a little bit about that, or maybe even get Neil on. But the rejection rate is pretty high, just because they get thousands of CFP submissions, and your talk may overlap 50% with another one, and that guy's got a working exploit already for whatever technology that you're working with. And guess what? They're going to go with that one, even though your approach may be more valid. But if somebody's got a working exploit, then all of a sudden they get a little bit of a bump. They get a little bit of a preference, right? So the expectation that you're just going to get accepted the first time you try is, should not be there. Some of the other conferences, definitely if you put a lot of thought into the CFP, that's where, you probably can push that a little bit, especially if you contact the organizers before you submit, right? I found actually talking to the organizers and asking them what they're looking for is a huge help. Sometimes they'll tell you on the actual website for the conference itself, but just reaching out and saying, hey, I've got all these talks that I've given in the past. What is something that you would be looking for? And then I'll put my CFP together after that, or I'll put my abstract together and build a new talk based on what I know for your conference. That seems to work pretty well. But again, the target for speaking at Black Hat and DEF CON, and that's definitely something that everyone should shoot for, right? If you enjoy public speaking and you want to get your name out there, there's probably no better way to do that. But the bar is pretty high nowadays, right? I think about some of the talks that we gave in the past, right? My first time I think was 2011, and I don't know if it would make it today. It just happened to be that in that current climate, it worked, and it was an interesting topic, and people came, and we did all right. And even the second time, the next year that I spoke on, the iOS stuff, it was just a congruence of, hey, this is what's going on in the industry, and I happen to be at the right place at the right time. So people want to talk about this, and they want to engage on this level. Nowadays, it'd be a lot more difficult. I don't know if my mobile testing skills or my tools are as interesting to a wider scope. Again, the conferences, you have to remember, are trying to apply their brand and what they're trying to accomplish in their audience. They're trying to bring more people in based on the speakers that they select, right?
So was 2011 Raft the response analysis fuzzing tool?
Yes, yeah. So 2011 was Raft, 2012 was Sierra, and then last year I gave the talk on security testing, right? Security unit testing, the Sputter framework. But the other thing that I've realized when it comes to those ones is originality is the key, right? This is not something that you're going to be able to, go and speak at 6 months before. It is very much, hey, they want exclusivity. So if it's a talk that you've given before, you get ranked lower. I mean, if you have if you're a big name, then maybe you can go back and speak again and again. I mean, I always used to give that it used to kind of tick me off. You'd watch Dan Kaminsky speak every year, right? and it was the same DNS exfiltration talk that he had given, a year prior, but he had just updated it. But he was such a big name that you couldn't fault him, right? Everybody wanted to get into his talk, so why not?
Yeah, that, by the way, I actually enjoyed that talk, the RAF talk. And yeah, the Dan Kaminsky talk, I remember that being,
it was kind of a running joke in the community for a while because it was,
yeah. He is a great speaker. This is one of those. All right, well, because there was that talk, and then there was like the one from him with, I don't know. I think it was the other running joke was like fixing SQL injection with base 64 encoding or some shit like that. I remember it was a long time ago, but regardless, very good speaker. I mean, you can't take that away from him. He's very interesting as a speaker. But I haven't really kept up with his work since then. Not to get off on another topic, but I think one thing people don't like submitters, because I think sometimes there's conferences like ShmooCon where if you submit, you get a free ticket regardless, or something like that. Or at least, I think they've changed that now so that it has to be a legit submission, because they were getting kind of half-assed submissions. But yeah, I mean that should be obvious, but it's not as it's not as obvious as it sounds like, apparently, because you do see a good amount of like really sort of half-assed submissions where you're like, okay, well, so pick a good title. Here's some basics. Pick a good title, something that's somewhat interesting or stands out. And if you saw it think of it like this way: if you looked on a piece of paper, a schedule, would that be something that would stand out to you or catch your attention? So that's the first thing. And then in terms of the description, be very descriptive in exactly what you're going to talk about. Fill out all the things. If they want to know if it's a 30-minute or a 40, if it's a 20-minute fire talk or if it's a full 45 minutes, explain all the little points, especially if it's a 45-minute talk of what you're going to cover, and create a little short abstract that looks good on. The reason they ask you for a long abstract and a short abstract, again, should be obvious, but the long abstract is, you tell us exactly what this is all going to be about. And the short, exactly what are you going to run through exactly in your talk? And is it going to fill up the space? And is it going to be interesting and maintain? That's what we need to know by judging to judge your talk. And then for a short abstract, this is the piece that's very likely going to end up on the website, on Sketch, whatever. Like that's going to be what people who attend are going to see. So just put yourself in the shoes of an attendee. That's probably the best way. Put yourself in the shoes of an attendee as well as the people that are going to review your talk. They may not know you. Especially if they don't, if you're not super well known, or you don't know a lot of people. And you have to think about like that they don't know you from Adam, and you have to sort of explain yourself on paper in your talk. So anything to add to sort of how to write a good CFP, Seth?
Yeah, I actually just linked it on the YouTube channel. What was super helpful to me, especially when I was doing Black Hat on my own, was reading through the sample submissions, right? Ones that they had picked up in the past, because exactly what you're saying is what you're reading is like, actually coming up with 4 or 5 different titles and then running them by people makes it a lot easier, right? Actually getting some feedback on your submission itself. Like, we're not even talking about the research that you're going to do, but hey, guess what? I'm thinking about having an abstract to do this research and using it as an impetus for you to actually spur that research along. There is a lot of time that goes into it. There's papers, there's all sorts of things, but I linked those sample submissions. Black Hat is really good about providing, stuff that was popular the last year that got high ratings from their CFP reviewers. And it's a big help, right? And not all conferences demand that level, especially when you're talking about some of the B-sides conferences, the volunteer conferences that are run. But stepping through their CFP submission form or process, think about someone that has to read, 100 of those or 30 of those to decide on the 10 that they want to choose. And that's going to give you put yourself in their shoes. That's going to give you a better shot at actually getting your submission accepted. But again, a rejection notice from a conference is not necessarily hey, this is just complete crap. It just may not be something that they're looking for, right? Submitting a security talk at a developer conference, right? They may or may not have space for that. They may only be looking for one security talk, and there were 5 that were submitted. You kind of have to separate your own like emotional state about your topic and about your talk from the acceptance level. I mean, in general.
Well, yeah, and I mean, like with OWASP, and I don't know if this is the case all the time, but it was the case when we were doing the AppSec DC, and I heard it's similar for other OWASP conferences where they, like, let's imagine you are, you're not a, I don't know, you're not a chapter lead, you're not a project leader, you're not a you haven't done an OWASP talk before. Your topic is not about anything OWASP related. Like, there is definitely a point system. Like, okay, so say for instance, I submit a talk for Ruby on Rails security, and I bring into the fold Rails Go, which I have done. Okay, at that point, depending on the conference, if it's an OWASP conference, I might get points for being the project leader on that, like literal points for ranking. And then there's the additional like point structure of just, what everybody else goes through as well. So you might end up getting ranked higher. It just depends on the conference, what the requirements are. And it also might be that like you have the same exact topic as somebody else, and that person has spoken at the conference before and did really well. And
Yep.
It's just, don't take it as a personal thing. I mean, because, I've been rejected. Seth's been rejected. If you're speaking, you've been rejected, like, period. So don't let that dishearten you. And
here's a hint though, if you do get accepted, right? Like I don't know. I mean, Amazon, like reInvent or something like that. Take a look at the mobile app, because you can probably give yourself high marks in the, on the grading. No one ever like submits feedback. There's very few people that do. So, and if there's IDOR, then you can probably give yourself even better marks from multiple people. Just saying, right? Like, that's probably, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
I found it funny when I was playing. It was like a local conference here, big data. It was like big mountain data conference. So it was not necessarily related to security. I think there was only like 5 or 10 people in my talk,
The live hacking.
Oh yeah. I was doing live hacking in that one, right? For sure. But part of it was I was playing with their, like their review system and, comment system. And so I gave myself like 5 or 6 different reviews. And then they email me a week later with them all like nice and collated in this email of all the comments that I gave to myself. It was kind of fun. Yeah.
I remember you tell me about that. That was like, just imagine you're the conference organizer. You have this mobile app, and one of your speakers is pwning your app as you, which I think was like the kickoff for you, where it started with like, I mean, maybe I don't want to ruin your surprise. Maybe that's part of Hacker Tracker talk, but
oh no,
like, yeah, you've screwed up so many. I remember sitting at reInvent with you, like trying to pwn their app. Well, I mean, for research and science purposes.
Research and science purposes. Yeah, that was the one where we could friend anyone based on IDOR, right? That was fun.
Yeah. Actually, we should mention, speaking of talks, Stefan has a talk coming up at Kurion, which is, I mean, no pressure, right? They said like, this is the I have a link to it, the tweet. Hold on. It says, this is going to be the most exciting conference talk you'll ever see. Like, what do you do with that? I mean, where do you go from there? And I'll post this link in. But basically, he's going to, I guess there's going to be some vulnerabilities that he's going to have the team, or sorry, the attendees be the red team. And then he's going to be the blue team and defend against those hacks using, which we need to have him on again and just explain all this. But I guess using type system and compiler settings, Those are the things he's going to use to just the language itself, like safe, sane defaults in the languages, I guess he's going to use. But this is Curry on Conf, and I'm going to put it into the Slack and the YouTube chat
Sweet.
as well.
No, that should be good. I mean, just make sure you have Google ready if you're going to any of Stefan's talk, because he's going to use words that you need to look up, right?
Yeah, he's a smart guy. There's no doubt. So, and let's see, is there anything in terms of like other talk? I just want to make sure I'm going back to our list here. I want to make sure if anybody had a cool talk coming up that we saw, I didn't miss it. I was just, gosh, I am not.
No, Brian. Yeah, Brian keeps bringing up besides PGH, right?
Yes.
Other things. I mean, everybody that's been in the industry has seen these, like the talks that get recycled. I mean, I'm guilty of this for sure. Is kind of taking one topic and then using it for a year or so or 6 months and farming it out to different small meetups and things like that. But that's different from actually using it against some of those big conferences. They ask you right up front if you've given that talk before. They're not going to accept something that is that has been used, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it's like I said, and so for those that are watching, I mean, what I said in rebuttal to that in Slack was, well, not rebuttal, but just more like, okay, there are definitely times where, okay, there's a conference in Virginia, and then there's a conference in Maryland, and you're submitting the same talk, but let's say that there's a conference in San Jose, and then there's a conference in Virginia, and the speaker's good, and the topic's interesting, and the talk itself is interesting. Well, I mean, that's fine. To me, that's fine. I think that's because you got different attendees spread, just the different people attending most likely, right? I mean, depends on the conference. Might have some folks that are, but then in that case, the folks that came from the other one, the small handful that had been to the one in San Jose, if it was like a big conference, right? I mean, then that frees them up to go see another talk anyways. So I don't know, like I think it's fine if it's like that geographically spread out. And again, interesting speaker and whatnot.
Yeah, I don't know. I've gotten in trouble before, right? Well, not in trouble, but I've spoken a lot down in Phoenix. I go down there, fairly often. I used to work for a company that's down there, but I've gone down and done meetups like OWASP, Phoenix. The organizer's a friend, so I've been down there a few times and spoken, and then Cactus Con as well. Andrew that runs that, I've spoken there. But one of those times that I went down for OWASP or whatever, I recycled like one of my experience stories, but in a different context. And some guy raises his hand at the end. He's like, "Well, didn't you tell that same story at Cactus Con?" And I was like, "Yeah, you got me, right? I definitely did." But guess what?
Called you out on.
But yeah.
Well, I mean, and to be fair, speaking of Cactus Con, I was just talking to Chris for our Brazil talk. I was like, "Hey, man, because you had brought it up, like we're all friends with Andrew. I'm like, I should probably reach out to him and see if, Cactus Con might have any interest in, this kind of a talk. And then I'll put in through the official CFP. I'm waiting on Chris to see if he wants to do it. But yeah, I mean, like that's an example of, okay, we did the talk once in Brazil and it wasn't recorded. Like it's perfectly fine in my mind to go give that same talk somewhere else. And also the tool will be farther along. So the talk will be a bit different. But like when we did the DevOps talk, we probably did the DevOps talks 3 places a year, roughly. Like conferences, we adjusted the material each time. Like sometimes it was more AWS, sometimes more, I don't know, like Redis and Memcache or whatever like tool we were picking apart. So like having that's different from having the same exact talk, I think. But yeah, so we want to do that. Since we're hitting an hour here, I did want to mention a few things before we get going.
Okay.
So like one of the things that we were talking about this earlier today in Slack, and I really want to get together a survey, and I'll probably take your advice and use SurveyMonkey, and we'll put this together. I think you and I will end up collaborating on this to get this survey out. But basically, an unbiased, like marketing wing of some bug bounty company. Like, I'm interested in some some facts around bug bounties from everyday researchers' standpoints. Not like there's nothing wrong with having like the top 10 researchers, but that's not really what I'm going for. I'm interested in the average person's experience. How much time does it take to find a bug? What's the average payout for them? What's the average severity? What's the average, what is it, rejection percentage? Those sorts of things. So if you have, as a viewer, you have any suggestions on things you'd like to see added to that survey, I want to get that together in the next week. So if you have suggestions, send that to absoluteappsec@gmail.com or paste it in the Slack channel, or DM us. I think the DMs are open. So whatever way you want to contact us, I'll add those in. But that's something I'm like a little personal research project, just out of pure curiosity, and wanted to get some answers there.
Yeah, I mean, that should be interesting, especially because we run into bug bounties again and again, right? I mean, we've talked about it multiple times on the podcast. We had Jason Haddix on. I mean, I'd like to have him on again at some point. But the mechanics of that, like how realistic is it that people, actually, make money on it? How much time do they need to spend? How much experience do they need to do something like that? And then you've got like your big bug bounty programs like HackerOne and BugCrowd and Synac. And then you've got smaller ones that are like the company itself is running it. And it's just some small, medium-sized, online company. What sort of feedback do you see there? I feel like there's a lot of like opportunity to actually talk through that and give people some pointers. And, at some point, we may even throw up a blog on, Absolute AppSec and talk through some of this, or at least give hints or point people towards specific directions. But but I want it to be realistic, right? I know what my experience has been, right? And what yours has, but it would be interesting to see that wide swath across the industry, because there's people, not everybody is in that top 10. Not everybody's spending 40 hours a week plus doing bug bounty programs. And whether or not it's paying out for them is probably an interesting data point, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of material out there from the top bug bounty people. There's plenty of material out there from the bug bounty companies. I was just reading a blog post that I shared with you today, and I'll put it in here. That's on Hacker Noon. And it tells you, hey, look, you probably can't spend and this is common. I do feel like that's pretty much common sense. Like, you can't spend just a few hours on a target and expect to find something. Like, you need to know how, what you're attacking, what's its functionality, what's its purpose, all that stuff. But again, I think there's there's not enough data that I've found from just your average researchers in an unbiased format. So definitely want to find out. The let's see, the other things are oh yeah, just it was more of like a WTF. Just, I guess this is the same, and we talked about it in the Absolute AppSec Slack chat. But to catch folks up, there's like this. I'm gonna put this link in YouTube. Basically, Jenkins came out with. I mean, they've got SSRF, CSRF. It's it's a lot of it's in plugins, security issues in their plugins. So I shouldn't solely point at Jenkins. I should just say that this is a list of Jenkins plugins that are vulnerable and that they've put some information out on. But like, this is, I mean. And I think it was Jason White who brought up the point, like, I think I forget exactly what he said, but the point was, gosh, now I want to go back and see exactly what he said, so I don't misquote him. But the gist was, can I find it? Let's see here. I don't want to misquote him. That's the silence on air. Oh, so he said he made a good point, which is this is truly considered like a hostile Jenkins is kind of considered, you have to think of it as like a hostile system, but like it's going to host your source code. Meaning like, and again, in our DevOps talks, we had actually talked about this. Like, it's obvious to say like, don't put Jenkins outside the perimeter. That's a very obvious thing. Even though if you go on Shodan right now, you'll find Jenkins systems outside the perimeter. But then, even further, you have to be careful of segregating Jenkins within your perimeter from vital systems. You're giving it source code, so you do have to be. I mean, it makes me nervous. Jenkins makes me nervous, and this is just another example of that. So I put the link in there.
I mean, where Jenkins does make you nervous. I remember Jenkins from your DevOps talks. I know I've played around with it. Like the amount of ways that you can screw that up, and that like security advisory from yesterday, right? It's mostly plugins, but I mean, the amount of stuff that you could do with those plugins would be amazing, right?
I did think it was ironic that Black Duck had 2 plugins that had issues.
Yeah.
And it's like an update on vulnerable dependencies of your Jenkins. And those dependencies are a tool that finds vulnerable dependencies. So that was just, it happens. Everybody who creates software creates vulnerabilities. And it's not a big deal. I mean, it is, you know what I mean? Like it does happen, but it was just kind of funny to me.
Well, I mean, what's your recommendation then, right? Like, let's dig into it a little bit. If you can't use Jenkins or you don't want to use something like that, where else do you go?
Well, I would say, first of all, with Jenkins, limit the plugins that you absolutely have to use. You and I have done this before where we actually did set up Jenkins and we actually had to use it in production and it had to be secure. So what did we do? We limited the environment of execution that it would meaning we ran it in a virtualized, segregated machine where it could only access, like network wise, it was completely set up. It was in the cloud, and in the cloud, it was completely isolated network wise from other machines. Sorry, my son's. Hi, buddy.
Poking his head in.
Yeah, he's poking his head in. So it was separated from other networks and other machines on
yeah, so you're taking a layered security approach, right?
Yeah, same as anything.
Utilizing it. I mean, one thing we were worried about RCE, right? I mean, we were building untrusted code in that environment.
Yeah, yeah.
Not to give away too many secrets, but yeah, that was kind of the threat factor, the threat model that we had built around it is, what happens when somebody actually writes some code, and when we do the build script or whatever, it actually makes a call out. It's trying to do something it shouldn't be able to do. We've got to be able to isolate it and shut that down or disallow it pretty quickly. So, I mean, we were almost coming at it from a different perspective than, hey, Jenkins might be the thing that's gonna cost us in the long run. But the approach is very similar because it is remote code execution that we're worried about.
Yeah, I don't think it matters anymore because the company that I worked for doesn't exist formally anymore. But there was a breach at a what would you call them? A group discount kind of company that I happen to work at. And, that was, from what I understand, I wasn't actually working there at the time, but from what I understand, Jenkins was involved. It's just, it's just not a great system. And, I think one other thing too is to even get to Jenkins, we put it, we talked about it inside the perimeter, but we use like a VPN to even get to it. So there are things you can do outside of that. I mean, you have to remember so you can run, it depends on your environment, but like with AWS, you've got your, what is it? I'm trying to remember. We used this before. It was Code Build or Code Pipeline, I want to say, which had, oh, right. So which had Code Build, which you could then bake in tests so that when you pushed code that Code Pipeline was watching, it would pull from your source, like GitHub or whatever AWS is Code Commit, I think, or something like that. So then it would detect that change, pull in the code, run tests using code build. And I think we did this to run Brakeman or whatever we were running. And then if it passes, cool. If it fails, the code does not proceed any farther down the code pipeline. I believe that's how it was set up.
Yeah, no, it was, right. I don't know, and that would be interesting, if you want to take a look at Amazon, but I'm sure it's violating your terms of service on your AWS account if you try to start calling out from the builds and to actually see what they're using behind the scenes. But I'm sure those guys have done that sort of a threat model, the same thing that you and I went through when we were trying to run untrusted code. So it's probably built in a specific location. It's isolated. If it makes it, it just gets black holed. And then, when they're done, they just wipe that code directly off that machine and move on. But I mean, AWS is a whole nother host of issues, right? When we start talking Lambda and untrusted code and everything else that goes on inside there, I can't imagine the sleepless nights that security team has. I just
well, and if you didn't, I don't know if Chris talked about it, but in our Weird Al talk, even funnier, one thing I didn't even realize is that when you, like one of the functions in this Weird Al tool, when you call the API for Lambda, you can get back a link, and that link allows you to download the source code. I don't know if it's like a temporary link or a permanent link. I don't really remember, but you do get a link to download all the source code that's in Lambda, which is, oh my, and you can re-upload. You can change the code and re-upload it back to Lambda. So like, let's say Lambda's got permissions to interact with KMS and decrypt something. Well, cool. You can totally like write in a line that says, take that, decrypt that KMS key and send it to me. And that'll work. You can just re-upload the code and it's good to go. I mean, this is all saying if you've got a stolen key with the permissions to access Lambda, I should say that. But yeah, like it's AWS obviously has its whole other set of.
Yeah, and speaking of that, like we talked about Weird Al last week, but like I told you, like the end of last week, I got into a code repository. Somebody had posted their AWS keys into the code. Man, all of a sudden I've got access to their root account, and I was using Weird Al to actually enumerate through everything that I could possibly see. Right? It was awesome. I'll just say it was super useful. So if anybody hasn't played with Weird Al yet, has access to keys, they should. That's all. There's my little plug for that.
Thanks, man. Yeah, we definitely have to do some stuff to make it a little bit easier to use. I've realized, but it's a project that's ongoing, and I just spent a couple hours doing something on it yesterday or the day before. I can't remember. I think it was Sunday night. But yeah, so we'll just keep plugging away at it, and hopefully people find it interesting. But yeah, so. In terms of alternatives to Jenkins, I don't, what are the popular ones are like Circle CI, Travis CI. They all have their ups and downs. If you're talking about, like, I think one of the huge benefits is that you can host Jenkins. You have complete control over it. And whereas if you're using something that's like a hosted SaaS type solution, then not so much. So yeah, just depends on your preference and your threat model, we'll say.
Which is we keep going back to that threat model, right? This episode for some reason, but that probably because I had to do threat models for a client recently, and about cyber criminals versus nation state attackers. It's always interesting. Cool. Let's see what else is going on, man.
I think we probably covered everything that we had on the agenda. So
yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you've got questions, the other thing is, right, Chris last week talked about, mentors and actually helping people out. If people are interested and like they're writing a CFP, jump on Slack, hit me up on a DM, right? Like I have no problems reviewing an abstract and telling you, hey, guess what? You probably need to change this or this. I've got some experience with it, and that's I'd be happy to see other voices actually in the community speak out. People that aren't as experienced as you or I. Just because you haven't given a talk before doesn't mean the stuff that you're bringing to the table isn't interesting, right? We've had this discussion. We talked about it with Charles a little bit as well. Is that there's a lot of different viewpoints rather than just the viewpoint that you and I have, and some of the most interesting talks and the interesting attacks that I've seen have come from people outside of the traditional information security industry or application security industry, because they understand things in a different way and they think about it in a different way. So if you're interested, if you want some feedback, let me know. I'd be more than happy to jump in and do something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you're interested in joining the podcast for an episode, we are also always looking for folks. I think I even asked Jason White. I don't know if we came to a determination on it. I think he said he was up for it. So always interested in hearing, like you said, everybody's sort of opinions. That's sort of the point. Even like Rob, where I started off in the beginning, just as an example, I started off in the podcast saying I don't agree with his opinion, but that's fine. That's perfect. That's why, that's good. We should have discussions where we, have civil discourse. That's good.
Yeah, I can't remember. I think we did a podcast with Rob years ago, right? I remember we argued about, I can't remember what it was, but there was something on there, right? Everybody's got a different opinion and a different take based on where they're coming from and what they see. And that's good. And if it was all the same, we wouldn't be able to push things forward much at all. So.
Yep. That one should definitely be interesting. They all are to me, but cool, man. Thanks everybody for watching, for sure.
Yeah. Thanks for joining today, listening to our rants. And I know we keep saying that we're going to get other stuff up on the website. We'll post, get into Slack. Obviously, Ken and I are pretty active on Slack and on Twitter. You can engage with us there, but hopefully we'll have the MP3s up soon enough on those other mediums. So
I just want to say to David Corsi, start jujitsu, and I will come to B-Sides Augusta, and we'll roll. But you got to get over your shoulder injury first, and then we'll roll in Augusta in Augusta. So
I'll let the two of you roll around in Augusta. Actually, I wouldn't. Yeah, maybe I'll submit to. That'd be a fun one to come out to.
Yeah, it's not too. It's heck, I enjoy. I actually had said in Slack I enjoy the B-Sides conferences, so
same. Cool. All right, thanks everybody. We'll talk soon.
All right, later. Bye.